Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm doing this landscape and I'm going to be using a combination of pastels and colored pencil. Let's start. I'm going to work in two stages. In the first one I'm going to use pastels and pastel pencils, and in the second one I'm going to switch to colored pencils. But first I'm going to do a little bit of sketching in order to work out the composition. And the paper I'm working on is a Fabriano drawing paper, toned paper called Clay. And pencils I'm going to work on are Kohinoor pastel pencils and some Conti pastel pencils. And in addition to that, I'm also going to use Kohinoor soft pastels. This lower part here will be a little bit darker, so I added a bit more value with this black pastel pencil. In the second stage, once I'm finished with the blocking in, I'm going to apply clear gesso, and then I will use colored pencils on top of that, but I'll get to that eventually. So in this initial stage I just want to get some of the tones that are similar to what I'm trying to achieve. We're going to have a little bit more of those bluish tones at the top and some slightly darker and greenish tones here at the bottom near the bank of the river. Now the reference will be in the description, and obviously the colors I'm going to achieve and the whole scene will be a little bit different, but you know, I'm just using it as a reference. I don't have to stick to it. Here at the top I started applying a bit more of the soft pastel because I realized that with pastel pencils things were going a little bit slower than I expected, and I simply needed a bit more of the material in order to be able to block in this top part of the scene, because I was actually initially hoping that this grayish color of my paper, and this is one of the reasons why I used this stone paper, I was hoping that this grayish color of the paper would work to my advantage and that I wouldn't really have to apply that much pastel in order to get the colors that I wanted. But I realized that I simply needed to put down more colors and more of the material in order to be able to blend it, and in order to be able to achieve not just the colors that I want, but also the values that I wanted. Because here, for example, at the bottom near the riverbank, I simply needed some darker tones because otherwise I wouldn't be able to achieve a sufficient amount of contrast. So I put in some black soft pastel and blended that in with some green and some blue. So this is just some initial blocking in, some initial colors, and I'm certainly going to be adding layers on top of that, layers of colors and some details and objects on top of that as well. But I want some more bluish tones here at the top. Now, what am I trying to achieve with this part of the scene here in the top portion of the paper? If you look at the reference, you will see that this is not the sky. This is actually kind of like a sunlit mountain slope, and it's also a little bit hazy. There's a little bit of fog there, which is why some of the details like the trees and shapes on that slope are a little bit difficult to discern. But some parts of that slope are a little bit more exposed to the sunlight and a little bit closer to our viewpoint, which is why they are a little bit more defined, and I can do those with some brighter colors. This is going to be the case with this portion to the right, for which I used a little bit of green pastel, but every now and then I keep coming back and adding a little bit of black pastel here and there in order to increase the contrast. So this top part is pretty much blocked in. I cleaned up the line of the river, and now I'm going to block in the bottom portion of the scene where we're going to have the river and of course the reflections. on the left, in the middle, there's going to be a part of the riverbank where we're going to have, which is protruding into the middle of our scene, and it's going to have some trees and bushes on it, which is going to make it a little bit more interesting, and which is going to give us an opportunity to create contrast with that rather smooth and blurry background. I started out by putting down some black pastel because I want the surface of the water to be a little bit darker, but I also wanted to have some bluish and greenish tones, which is why I added a little bit of blue and then a little bit of green. I added more of the green on the left side because that part of the water will be reflecting the riverbank, and the more bluish part in the middle and on the right will be reflecting mostly sky and the lighter part of that mountain slope. So I need that to be even lighter, so I'm putting in some more of that light sky blue color, which is a pastel soft pastel that I used. So I used a combination of soft pastels and pastel pencils in this initial stage. And I also wanted to add a touch of this phthalo blue. This is something like a medium phthalo blue, just to make the colors a little bit warmer. And finally, a little bit of this yellowish green. This is a Conti pastel pencil. So I don't really have any specific brand that I use. I just use whatever I have. And I mostly have Kohinoor or Conti's when it comes to pastels. I also have some Master's Touch pastels, but I'm not going to use them here. And later, when I switch to colored pencils, I'm going to use Faber-Castell Polychromos. So now the scene is blocked in with pastels, and now I'm going to apply clear gesso. Don't panic, this is not going to smudge that badly. It is going to smudge a little bit, but applying clear gesso on top of it will do a couple of things. First, it will fix the pastel in place better than any fixative, meaning that all the dust won't interfere with the second part of the process, and it will reduce the need for the fixative later once the drawing is finished. And the second thing it's going to do, it's going to blend those colors a little bit, almost as if I were painting. Now the colors will change a little bit, and there will be some leftover brush marks or brush strokes, but you know, that's fine. That's nothing to worry about, because it will have another effect. This clear gesso that I'm applying, it will provide us with a whole new tooth that I can work with, because clear gesso creates a rough, textured, sanded surface similar to sanded papers, and you can apply multiple layers on top of that. So I will already have my base layers in there, and I will be able to apply a couple more layers on top of that, so I will get a very nice tooth to work with. And that's probably the main advantage of clear gesso. Now when this dries, it will dry clear, so it's transparent, and you don't need to worry about it being light or it being white. You need to leave it for at least 12 hours so that it dries and hardens, and once it's dry, you will feel that the surface of the paper is rough, like sanded paper. Not quite like sandpaper, but very close. And once I have that, I can work on top of that with colored pencils. Now, in this stage, I'm going to work with colored pencils exclusively. I'm going to start with some light phthalo blue, and I'm going to put that on top of this top part of the scene to make it a little bit more bluish. And you can see that I can even blend this with my finger. Now, for those of you who are new to this technique, you may be wondering, well, how can you blend colored pencils with your finger? It's because of the surface. It's not the pencil, it's the surface. So I'm using a sanded surface which grinds on the pencil, creating more residue that you can move around. So On this surface, even colored pencils behave a little bit more like pastel pencils, but they do stick to the surface of the paper a little bit better, and they are better for details. Speaking of details, now I'm going to start drawing some smaller shapes on that top part of the scene where, like I said, like I've already explained, we have mountain slope or some hills above that riverbank, and it's a completely wooded area with lots of trees, lots of canopies of trees, and the tops of those canopies are catching some of that warm light from the sun. And this part of the scene is very blurry, so you won't be able to discern all of the details. There won't be that much texture, but you will be able to see how these tops of the canopies, tops of the trees, stand out against the rest of that slightly blurry background. And on top of that dull bluish grayish background, I used some much lighter and brighter colors, like some lighter greens and even a touch of some yellowish and orangey tones. Now once you blend that with a tortillon, and by the way, tortillons work really well on this surface, you get softer marks and you remove a little bit of the texture. The reason why I want to subdue that texture a little bit is because I want this part of the scene to be a little bit more blurry, so the textures and the details wouldn't be too distracting, because I'm going to want to have more detailed elements, more detailed objects in the foreground and in the midground. Now this part of the scene here to the right is catching a bit more light from the sun. It's a little bit more exposed to the sun rays, and I'm going to make it a little bit warmer, a little bit brighter, but I'm also going to give it a little bit more texture. So I used a little bit of the orange, maybe a touch of cinnamon, and a bit of May green. May green is kind of like it's fairly bright but slightly yellowish green, but it's a little bit duller than light green, obviously. And I also want some orangey tones here on the right, for which I used a sanguine and then a little bit of this orange colored pencil. Now these orangey and yellowish tones, you can interpret them any way you like. You can take it that it means that the warm sunlight is hitting the top of those canopies, or maybe that this is a scene in early autumn. Doesn't really matter, but we're going to have some very nice looking colors and some very nice contrasts in colors. Not just contrasts in terms of value, but also contrasts in terms of the color spectrum. I'm adding a little bit of this light yellowish green, and then I decided to add a touch of black colored pencil here and there, just so that I would increase the contrast a little bit. The closer this part of the scene is to our viewpoint, the more contrast and the more defined it needs to appear. But I still mustn't leave too much texture, which is why I'm softening it with a tortillon. And as I've already mentioned, these tortillons work pretty well on this surface, and I tend to use homemade tortillons, except that I always like to have at least a half a dozen of them lying around, because I'm going to use different ones for different colors, so that I would avoid muddying. So the purpose of them is not so much to blend, but to soften some of the marks. I suppose that's also a form of blending, but to soften the marks, to soften the textures, and basically control the amount of texture and detail in different parts of the scene. In those areas where I want a little bit of illusion of detail, like here for example, I'm just going to drag the pencil and allow it to create a little bit of that interesting texture, so that the viewer can interpret that there are some interesting details there. Now I'm going to define the line of the water, for which I'm using a relatively sharp white pencil. So this part of the river is going to be lighter, it's going to be reflecting a little bit of light. And I'm going to be adding a few more of those lighter marks to indicate very gentle movement of the water, maybe a few ripples here and there, and maybe some light parts of the water which are reflecting some of that sunlight. I can throw in a few of those lighter marks to make it look like the water is glistening, and also a touch of this phthalo blue, because I want to make this part of the scene a bit more bluish. Now, I probably should have done that first, but it's okay, I can always bring back those lighter marks with a white pencil. Anyway, now that the top part of the scene is largely done, we have a couple more big things to do here on the left side, which is the trees, of course. These trees are a part of the midground, I suppose. And all the way on the left we're going to have some taller trees and bushes. So it's going to be like a thicket, a bunch of trees and bushes. And I want these to be a little bit more defined in terms of both detail and texture, and of course I'm going to need a bit more contrast there as well. And again, I'm also going to want to make sure that at least some parts of that canopy are catching some of that warm light and are stand out against the darker tones. So my approach was first to lay down the greenish tones, and now on top of that I'm working with a black pencil. This is a very simple technique that I've used in many of my previous drawings and tutorials, but what can I say, it works, or at least it works for me. It allows me to do two things. It allows me to modify colors, it allows me to create a texture that looks like foliage, it allows me to break up these larger shapes into smaller shapes, smaller segments, because when you look at trees at a distance you will see like these clusters of leaves which form around the larger branches, and that's sort of what I'm trying to achieve here. I want to break up this group of trees and bushes into some slightly smaller shapes, and I hope that it's working. And the approach that I'm using is essentially I'm using black pencil to go over the green areas by using small short circular marks. Now, because I have a textured surface, I can go back on top of that with a lighter pencil to add some lighter details. So I can go back and forth between working from light to dark and from dark to light. This is what this surface allows me to do. Clear gesso creates that sort of a textured surface. Now obviously there are superior surfaces, there are better artist quality sanded papers like UArt and Pastel matte, but I find that this surface, paper primed with clear gesso, is particularly good for landscapes because of that rough tooth, that rough texture. I really like that rough tooth because it allows me to create all sorts of effects when I'm drawing trees and bushes and rocks and dirt, ground, all kinds of surfaces, all kinds of objects that you can see in nature. And if you're worried about the tooth, you can always knock that texture back a little bit. You can always smooth it out a little bit, either by using blending tools or by layering on top of them with lighter pencil and muddying things a little bit. We have another tallish tree here in front of this group of trees on the left, and I want this one to be a little bit more elaborate, a little bit more detailed, for which I'm going to use a black colored pencil first to draw the shape of this tree trunk. The tree trunk is kind of splitting into two large parts and fanning out with its large boughs and branches. And you can see that I'm drawing interrupted shapes, not drawing continuous shapes of branches. That's because I want some parts of that system of branches to be obscured by the canopy. I want some of them to be visible, others will be hidden behind the canopy. I can work on top of them with a lighter pencil, but maybe I would get a little bit of muddying, so it's safer, I think, to just leave a little bit of clean spaces for the lighter colors, so that I can lay down those first. And I'm going to start with some lighter greens first, and then maybe later I can throw in some slightly darker colors. So I started with some really light colors, and then I switched to my May green, which I used as a base color for a lot of the other trees and surfaces in this drawing already. I'm going to use this as a base color for much of the foliage on this tree, and once I have that in place, I'm going to work on top of that with a black colored pencil again. I think the branches look pretty good, they look pretty realistic. Now if you're wondering how to draw these, the trick is to allow your hand to wiggle a little bit like it's shaking, and to remember that you gotta change the direction in an unpredictable manner every now and then, and that you gotta make them sort of fan out and grow one out of the other, and make them taper as they grow out, because they're thicker near the base and they get thinner and thinner, and they spread into smaller and smaller branches and twigs. So as long as you can remember to do those two things, I think you will end up with some realistic looking branches. But of course, practice makes perfect. I'm not saying that mine are perfect, but I feel like I am getting better every time I draw tree branches, or I feel like I am. Anyway, I'm working with a black colored pencil now, working on top of the of those green areas, modifying the color and adding texture at the same time, making this look more like actual foliage, but at the same time creating those shadow areas in the foliage, making it look like some parts of that canopy of the tree are less exposed to the sunlight. They're hidden deeper inside the canopy and further away from the light source, which is why they're darker, while others are fully exposed to the light source, which is why they're lighter. And I even added some warmer colors, like some yellowish and orangey colors, to make it look like that part of the canopy is catching some of that warm sunlight from above. And here in this part of the scene, I'm going to add some shadows to better define this part of the riverbank and to create a little bit of variation in that part of the terrain. I want this part to be a little bit lighter, so I'm going to use this light yellowish color. This is a very light yellow color. I don't know the exact name or number in the Faber-Castell range, but when you put it on top of green, it becomes a light yellowish green, which is exactly what I need, a very light greenish color. But here, lower down, I used a little bit of darker green, which is a chromium oxide green, and then I'm going back and forth adding some lighter details and darker details, and I added a touch of some brownish tones as well, so that it looks like maybe there is also some dirt in there, that it's not all grass. I didn't really like the shape of this lower part of the tree trunk, so I decided to make it a little bit thicker, so that it looks maybe a little bit better, maybe makes a little bit more sense, and I added a few branches here and there. I also have to make sure that I make the lower part of the canopy a little bit darker and the upper part of the canopy a little bit lighter, because those lower hanging branches and clusters of leaves at the bottom will be darker because they're further away from the light source, or they're facing away from the light source rather. I'm still refining the appearance of this riverbank, this protruding area here in the middle and to the left, and I'm also adding some details here which will stand out against this shadow area on the left to make the grass more interesting. Here I'm going to have some stones and rocks on the riverbank, and I first worked with a little bit of light grey, and then I worked around them with some black colored pencil to add some shadows and to make those individual shapes stand out a little bit better so that I could achieve a bit more contrast. And I want to have some of those rocks kind of protruding here into the middle part of the scene on the river, and a little bit of shadow under them as well as above them, so that you could tell where the grassy part ends and the rocky part begins. I'm going to have another lighter grassy area here to the left, which is maybe catching a little bit more light from the light source, and the rest of it is the shadow. Maybe the shadow is coming from this tree here, maybe from some other tree. Doesn't really matter. I'm going to leave some of these things to the viewer's interpretation. And now I'm going to draw some lighter ripples here around the stones with the white pencil, and then maybe a few reflections with a grey pencil for the stones, and then some greenish tones for the reflections of those green areas above the water. When drawing reflections, you don't want to worry about every single exact shape. What you want to do is you want to focus on the values. If you have areas of darker value above the water, you want to try to mirror them in your reflection, so that you have areas of darker value being reflected in the surface of the water, and where you have areas of lighter value, like those yellowish lighter parts of the riverbank, I'm going to just put some lighter details or lighter values in that part of the surface of the water. And I'm going to do the same thing with these light bluish tones, because maybe some parts of the sky are breaking through those trees. I'm going to make that part of the surface of the water a little bit lighter, and then just adding a few touches of yellow here and there. I can leave a little bit of texture, maybe a few of those marks, so that they look like ripples, but for the most part I'm going to want to drag them down so that they're softened a little bit and so that they look like reflections. I want to make them look a bit smoother so that this looks like actual surface of the water. And now I'm going to draw the reflection of this tree trunk, which is why I'm going to use a black colored pencil, because I need some slightly darker values, darker marks. So I think you can see how my plan is coming along. My first stage was basically working with pastels to cover and block in larger areas where I need to do more blending. And the second stage, I'm simply refining the details and modifying the textures and colors by using colored pencils, which are more suitable for that purpose and which work pretty well on this surface because it's a sanded surface. I added a little bit of bluish tones here in the middle and to the right, because that part is going to be reflecting the more bluish and lighter part of the scene. And I also decided to add a few ripples here and there to make the surface of the water more interesting and to break up the reflected images. And for that I used a very light grey on this shadow side of the river, where maybe I don't want some of these marks to be completely white. I don't want them to be too bright. But as I move a little bit further to the middle and more to the right, I'm gonna use a bit more of the white colored pencil for those lighter ripples and those parts of the water which are glistening and reflecting a little bit of light from the light source. So I think this is making the surface of the water a bit more interesting, and I'm also going to add a few stones, maybe a few rocks here on the right side, just to complete the scene, I suppose. Those are going to be pretty dark, mostly with a black colored pencil, and I'm going to add a few ripples around them as well, so that they look better integrated into that surface of the water. Just adding a few more ripples there. Eventually I decided to simplify the surface of the water a little bit by blending in some of the ripples, because I felt that maybe some of them are a little bit too much, maybe less is more in some cases. And another thing that I realized was that some of the values and colors in my reflection were a little bit off, so I decided to move things around a little bit, make this part a little bit bluish, so that the reflection maybe makes a bit more sense. It doesn't have to be perfect, obviously, because the colors are different, there's the movement of the water and things like that, but you got to try to make it look sort of similar so that it looks more convincing. I added a touch of brown and cinnamon to these rocks, and then went back in to add a few cleaner marks for those lighter details in the water, because there was a little bit of muddying while I was blending. So those were just the finishing touches. Now I'm going to put my signature in the lower right corner, and then the drawing will be finished. Now, if you want to see longer videos and a lot more content, you should really check out my Patreon, because you'll find full-length narrated videos there. But also here, don't forget to subscribe, give me a like and comment. Let me know what you think. I'm going to see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.